continue with chapter 14. We're still in the Civil War. I'm hoping to finish this chapter on Thursday. I don't know.
6-7.
6-7. All right. Let's see. We are to 1862. We talked about how the Union wants to take the Mississippi River and cut the Confederacy in half. So they took New Orleans, the largest city in the South. So the Union Navy, the Union military now controls everything from New Orleans to the mouth of the Mississippi. And remember, one of the main goals is to take the entire Mississippi. So we're going to see some more battles take place as we go through the war along that river. All right, let's see. September of 1862, Confederate General Robert E. Lee decides to take the war to the north. You remember that 90 to 95% of the battles are taking place in the South during this war. So the Confederacy has been fighting a defensive war. Now Lee will try to change that to an offensive war. Lee and his 50,000 man army will cross the Potomac River into Maryland. This becomes the first of 2 invasions of the North. Several battles will occur in Maryland, but the largest battle will take place at Antietam, also known as Sharpsburg. This one-day battle will become the bloodiest one day in U.S. history. To this very day, it is the bloodiest one day in U.S. history. There'll be 23,000 casualties. And when you hear the word casualties, that means dead, wounded, missing. Dead, wounded, and missing. There'll be over 4,000 dead. This is the bloodiest day in American history. This outranks 9/11. It outranks Pearl Harbor. It outranks D-Day. And the Union wins that battle. And y'all watched a video about that, the 150th anniversary of that battle.
This battle called
Antietam or Sharpsburg, depending on which side you're on. Sharpsburg is the name of the town, Antietam is the creek that runs through it. On January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Abraham Lincoln actually writes up the Emancipation Proclamation right after the Battle of Antietam. It goes into effect as law on January 1st, 1863. Now, a lot of people think the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. It does not. It does not liberate all the slaves. It did not end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation only affects the areas controlled by the Confederacy, but it has no legal authority to do anything. No legality of freeing slaves in an area not controlled by the side making the law. You know, Abraham Lincoln makes this law, it has to do with the South. They're not going to listen. But it gave slaves another reason to run away. After this Emancipation Proclamation, wherever the Union Army went, runaway slaves are going to follow. The proclamation is going to merge the idea of preserving the Union at all costs, but now freeing the slaves. When this war first starts, Abraham Lincoln, his main goal is to preserve the Union, preserve the country. He said nothing about freeing slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation now changes the meaning of this war. Now, we're going to free the slaves and preserve the Union. Now, at the beginning of this war, black men could not join the Army, but they could join the Navy. The beginning of this war, African Americans or runaway slaves were employed as laborers and cooks, not soldiers in the Union Army. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, they can now join the Army. So that's 1863, in the middle of the Civil War. An estimated 180,000 men are going to serve in the Union Army, runaway slaves and freedmen. 180,000. An estimated 24,000 will join the Navy. 24,000. And a third of all those numbers will die in this war. 16 soldiers and 8 sailors will receive the Medal of Honor during the Civil War, the highest award for military valor. And unfortunately, some of them will not receive this honor until after the Civil War. Now, just because they're in the Union Army and they're not going to be treated equal, not at all. They're going to be paid less. They're going to fight in segregated units. What's segregated mean? Divided. Black troops fight in one group, white troops fight in the other. But they'll have white officers. In the Navy, it's different. They will be treated equal. They will eat and serve side by side with the white sailors, and they will be paid the same. Now, the black soldiers captured in battle by the Confederacy, they could either be sold back into slavery or sold into slavery, because many of them were never slaves, or immediately executed by the Confederate forces. There is an example of a man named Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, and that name's going to come back up in history. Nathan Bedford Forrest and his army will capture Fort Pillow, Tennessee in 1864. 200 of the 262 black troops killed at Fort Pillow are going to be executed after surrender. 200 out of 262. Now, Frederick Douglass, remember Frederick Douglass? The main black abolitionist? He will be key in getting African Americans to be allowed to fight in the Union Army. Anyone ever seen the movie Glory? No? It's a great Civil War movie. It is based on a true story about the 54th Massachusetts all-volunteer African American unit. They will take Fort Wagner in South Carolina, and most of them will be killed trying to take that.
Sorry, teachers, for the interruption. Would the following students please come down to the cafeteria? Alex DeYoung, Trinity Dowell, Xander Wedeking, Carter Kephart, or any other winners who received the Young Writers Horror Anthology Award-winning contest. Please come to the cafeteria. Thank you.
All right. Any questions so far? We're moving right along. All right, we're going to go back to the capture of the Mississippi River. A particular campaign called the Vicksburg Campaign. Vicksburg is in Mississippi. In the summer of 1862, General Grant of the Union Army wants to take down the Confederate fortress of Vicksburg. Vicksburg has one of the largest fortresses along the Mississippi River. Remember, one of the goals of the Union is to control the Mississippi River. So Grant is going to try several different expeditions to take Vicksburg. He will dig canals, he will break levees, he will explore the swamps north of the city. Everything he does will fail. So Grant decides to take his army south of the city. So Vicksburg is on Mississippi, in Mississippi. Louisiana is next to Mississippi. He takes his troops south on the Louisiana side, 20 miles of the city of Vicksburg. He crosses the Mississippi River and heads towards the capital of the state of Mississippi, and that would be Jackson. Several battles will occur at a place called Raymond, Mississippi, and then of course Jackson, and Grant will capture the capital of Mississippi. Then he heads west towards Vicksburg, and if you were to drive from Vicksburg to Jackson today, it's about a 45-minute drive. He will head west towards Vicksburg. The Confederate Army will retreat into the town, and there'll be several battles that take place. Battle of Champion Hill, Battle of Bridgeport. The Confederacy loses both. And the siege of the city of Vicksburg will begin. Confederates had built 15 miles of trenches and forts in a semicircle on the east side of Vicksburg. Let's see if I still have a map or not. Nope. So Vicksburg sits here, Mississippi River is here, so they build trenches and forts on a semicircle from the northern part of Vicksburg to the southern part of Vicksburg. This siege will last 47 days. The Union will shell the city from land and ship every single day for 47 days. Both sides will shoot at each other every single day. In the town, there is around 4,500 civilians who are trapped. There is no way out. The citizens will dig over 500 caves in the hills in Vicksburg to live during the siege. And as the siege went on, supplies dwindled down to nothing. There will be reports coming out of the city that civilians began eating dogs, horses, mules, and rats. All wooden fences and porches will disappear because they will use that as firewood. Fewer than 12 civilians will be killed. Finally, on July 4th, 1863, the Confederate Army of Vicksburg will finally surrender because they are out of supplies. This is one of two battles considered the turning point of the Civil War, and both battles end on the same exact day, July 4th, 1863. The other battle is one of the largest battles on the North American continent ever. And that battle is called Gettysburg. And y'all watched the video about that too already. General Lee will invade the North for the second time. And the Confederate and Union armies will meet at a place called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on July 1st, 1863. This battle will last 3 days, and we'll see a lot of killing. This battle will have more than 50,000 casualties over 3 days. Confederacy will lose this battle. On July 4th, 1863, the Confederate Army retreats back to Virginia. 4 months after this battle, President Lincoln will go to Gettysburg and dedicate the National Cemetery. And he'll make a very famous speech known as the Gettysburg Address. And y'all saw a video on that already too. Now, Gettysburg is one of the largest battles ever. And a large portion of it is preserved to this very day. If you were to go to Gettysburg, it's going to take you 3 days to see everything. So that's 1863. Remember that date, July 4th, 1863. Remember that date. Two battles, the turning point of the American Civil War. 1864, General Grant will begin a campaign to try to take the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. Numerous battles are going to occur. One such battle is called the Battle of Cold Harbor. That battle is only 30 minutes long, and you will have 8,500 casualties in 30 minutes. He's unable to take the capital, so Grant looks south towards a town called Petersburg. He felt that if Petersburg falls, then the capital of the Confederacy will fall. And the reason he thought this is because there are numerous railroad lines coming out of Petersburg and going to Richmond, which means if he was to cut those railroad lines off, Richmond will no longer get any supplies. So in June of 1864, he begins a siege of the city of Petersburg. That siege will last 292 days, or about 10 months. And he's going to try so many different things to try to break Petersburg. One such example of him trying to take Petersburg is there's a regiment from Maine. They're going to charge the earthworks around Petersburg in June of 1864. When they advanced onto the earthworks, they had 850 soldiers when they began their attack. 10 minutes after advancing on the Petersburg, 74%, or 632 out of 850 men, will be shot down in 10 minutes. And the reason is because the Confederate Army had cleared the land in front of their earthworks for 500 yards. So it's all open land. There's nothing to hide behind. So they were able just to shoot the men down as they charged the earthworks. During the 10-month siege, the Union Army tried to break Confederate lines in several types of attempts. Another attempt will be by a Pennsylvania regiment who will dig a tunnel 511 feet long from the Union lines to the Confederate lines. They will place 4 tons of black powder at the end of the tunnel under the Confederate lines. They will explode it. A 170-foot section of the Confederate lines will disappear. And what occurs next is known as the Battle of the Crater. 10,000 Union troops will pour into the crater, only to find themselves trapped and crowded. And the Confederate troops found it easy targets of the Union troops inside that crater. They will stand on top of the crater and just fire into the Union troops, killing some 3,000 inside that crater. To break the siege and capture Petersburg, General Grant began spreading his troops south of the city of Petersburg, forcing General Lee to do the same. Now the problem is, Grant had more men than Lee. Grant had over 60,000 troops. Lee had about 19,000 troops. Grant will send troops southwest of the city of Petersburg. Lee will send a third of his army to pursue them. They will meet at a place called Five Forks. And literally, there's 5 roads meeting together there. I've seen it. That's why it's called Five Forks. The Confederate forces will lose that battle at Five Forks. And instead of retreating back into the city and back into the earthworks, they go the opposite way. So Lee loses a third of his army. The next day, General Grant orders all his troops to attack the earthworks all at the same time. Of course, the Confederate troops cannot hold them back, and they will begin retreating out of the city. Petersburg falls. Richmond also falls the next day. Union troops will head to Richmond. They're going to capture the capital of the Confederacy, but the war is not over. Confederate forces within Richmond will burn the city to the ground. They'll burn their own capital to the ground. Why do you think they're going to burn their own city to the ground? This is very common practice during the Civil War.
So we can't have access to the stuff they have?
Yeah, that's exactly right. To keep the supplies out of the Union hands. Remember, you need supplies for any type of war. So they burn their own city to the ground, so the Union can't have their supplies. Now, there's a presidential election in 1864. Remember, all presidential elections are in November. Lincoln wins. And again, not on the ballot in the South. Lincoln will order General Sherman to take the war into the deep South and make the Confederacy pay. Sherman and his army will leave Chattanooga, Tennessee, and head towards Atlanta, Georgia. This is what we call the beginning of his march to the sea. Atlanta, Georgia will burn to the ground. And as Sherman and his troops move south from Atlanta, they will burn and loot everything. Reports out of Georgia, there are Union soldiers that are looting civilian homes and burning civilian homes. One lady reported that her dog had died one morning. She buried it. And Union soldiers came back over a 2-day period of time, 6 different times, and dug that dead dog up. Anyone want to guess why they're digging up a dead dog? They don't know it's a dead dog. Why would they start digging up stuff?
Burn. To burn.
No. The civilians were hiding all their valuables. So the Union Army was looking for it and looting and taking all their valuable items. And burning everything, of course. So they're gonna burn and loot everything. His army actually splits off into 3 different armies and goes into Georgia and just burns and loots everything. Sherman will march from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. Savannah, Georgia is right on the coast. Then his army will go north into South Carolina and North Carolina. So why are they burning and looting everything? Why do you think they're doing that? There's 2 reasons.
So he's prepared to pay?
Make them pay, yeah. They're destroying the Southern people's morale. And they're also hoping that Confederate troops will hear about this and run away from the Confederate Army and go home. They're hoping they will desert the Confederate Army, which means there'll be less troops to fight. They're destroying the people's morale in the South. So they don't want to fight anymore. And can you imagine an army coming to your family's house and burning it to the ground and stealing everything that's valuable? And then going to your neighbor's house and doing the same thing, and the next neighbor's house, and the next neighbor's house, and the next neighbor's house? How would you feel? Not real happy, right? Yeah. So, it works. It destroys the people's morale in the South completely, especially in Georgia. Now, at the beginning of 1865, January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution becomes law. What does the 13th Amendment to the Constitution do? Abolishes slavery in the United States. It abolishes slavery in the United States. But do you think the slave owners in the South just gave up their slaves because, Lincoln passed the law? No, of course not. They're not going to just give up their slaves because Lincoln passed the law. So the war still goes on. Slavery will officially not end until June of 1865. What's that date? Oh. It's a national holiday now. It was originally a Texas holiday, but now it's a national holiday. Juneteenth, there you go. Now, it was originally a Texas holiday because that is when Texas slaves down along the Galveston area found out they were freed. President Biden will make it a national holiday very recently. Originally, it was a Texas holiday. But some slave owners will hold on to their slaves all the way until 1866. Just because it creates the 13th Amendment doesn't mean it just ends. So it takes until 1866 for some of the slave owners to finally give up their slaves. Now, here's another date you need to remember. April 9th, 1865. General Lee will surrender his army at a place called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Remember, General Lee is the main general of the main Confederate Army. And remember, there was 23 armies. It was just one of 23 armies that will surrender. So the war is not over. The newspapers will announce that it was over. It's not over. There's a video.
Today is the 150th anniversary of the old Appomattox Street. It saved a young and struggling nation from division. Tonight, David Martin takes us back to where it all happened.
It was just a red brick house at a little crossroads in southern Virginia. Still, the winds of war turned it into one of the most important places in American history, Appomattox. A place author Jonathan Horn says no one should ever take for granted.
It's so easy to look at Appomattox and forget that nothing was inevitable at that moment.
In these fields, just outside town, General Ulysses S. Grant and 65,000 Union troops cornered General Robert E. Lee and his remaining force of 30,000 starving Confederate soldiers. Gray Fox, says Ranger Patrick Schroeder, had finally been run to ground.
He said he would rather die 1,000 deaths than go have to meet with General Grant.
What do you think was going to happen to him?
He expected to be General Grant's prisoner.
At 1:30 in the afternoon, Lee and Grant met.
What's at stake in these 2 minutes? What's at stake is the future of this country. Will we be one country again?
After 4 years of war and 700,000 dead, the man known as Unconditional Surrender Grant wrote out the terms he thought President Lincoln, with his promise of malice toward none and charity toward all, would want.
Grant offers very generous terms. He's not going to punish the South. He's going to parole these soldiers and allow them to go home.
It was over in 90 minutes. Lee called for his horse.
General Grant takes off his hat to General Lee as he's riding by, and the rest of his staff follows in that salute, as you will, and General Lee doffs his hat to General Grant as he rides away.
And then what does he tell the troops?
He can barely speak, but it's something along the lines of, go home and become good citizens.
The Union troops begin to fire their rifles in the air, and eventually artillery begin to fire salutes, and Grant orders it stopped. He says, stop the firing, the rebels are countrymen again.
Headlines trumpeted the news. The end. Union victory. Peace. But one in particular captured what really happened in those 90 minutes. Our nation redeemed. David Martin, CBS News, Appomattox, Virginia.
All right, like I said, the war's not over. That's April 9th, 1865. On April 14th, 1865, several days after the surrender of General Lee, President Lincoln and his wife are going to go to a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to celebrate Lee's surrender. A man named John Wilkes Booth will sneak into Lincoln's sitting area and shoot Lincoln in the back of the head. You have to remember, there is no Secret Service at the time. That comes much later in U.S. history. He had one guard, and that one guard was not there. He had gone downstairs. Lincoln will be taken across the street to a boarding house where he will die the very next day. This was a conspiracy. Booth killing Lincoln, because there was other men involved. The vice president was supposed to be killed, but the man that was supposed to kill him chickened out and got drunk. The Secretary of State, William Seward, was stabbed multiple times that same night, but he lived. Lincoln's body will be taken by train from Washington, D.C. to New York, to Philadelphia, to Chicago, and finally to Springfield, Illinois. Over 1 million people will walk by Lincoln's coffin. For them to do this, so his body wasn't deteriorating, Lincoln was embalmed a lot on the train trip. He was embalmed so much it was unreal.
What does that mean?
So they embalm people today. When you die, they take all your blood and organs out and fill you up full of chemicals so your body doesn't deteriorate. They do that to this very day. And embalming was pretty new at this time. But they embalmed him so much that in the early 1900s, a group of men tried to steal Lincoln's body. And they didn't succeed, but the police showed up, captured these guys. The tomb they was in, part of it was open. They went in, opened the rest of it, opened his coffin. He looked just like he did when he died. This is the early 1900s when this happens. He died in 1865. He was embalmed a lot. Now, the North will go into mourning. The South, they're happy. Most people in the South are real happy about this. John Wilkes Booth will later be cornered in a barn in Virginia. They supposedly shot him in the neck. They burned the barn. He supposedly dies. But there is evidence that he did not die. That was somebody else. And the conspirators that were supposed to kill the vice president, supposed to kill the Secretary of State, they catch all of them. They catch some other people that helped John Wilkes Booth. They will have a big trial on all these people, and all of them will be executed. Now, the last battle of this war actually takes place right here in Texas, at a place called Palomino Ranch, which is 12 miles east of Brownsville, Texas. This happens a little over a month after Lee surrendered. Happens on May 12th, 1865. Now the Confederacy wins that battle, but of course they're going to lose the war. And the reason this battle takes place is because poor communication. They didn't know Lee surrendered, so they fought another battle. The last Confederate general to surrender will be a Cherokee named Stan Waite. His battalion of Creek, Seminole, and Cherokees and Osage Indians, they're not going to surrender until June 23rd, 1865, over 2 months after Lee surrendered. And they surrender in Oklahoma at a place called Dokesville. It's going to take a while for all the armies of the Confederacy to surrender. They don't do it when Lee does it. It takes time. So this war lasts 4 years. Somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 Americans died, 2% of the population at the time. Like I said, today, if 2% of our population died, it would be somewhere around 7 million. Every American felt this war, especially if you lived in the South. And you have to remember that, because what's to come after the Civil War explains why the South is the way it is. It's because of this war. These people didn't just go, well, war's over, now let's go back to normal. It causes drama. It causes their life to be turned upside down. It destroys the Southern economy. You just don't return to normal after a war. Nowhere in the world does that happen. So to understand what happens after the Civil War and the way the South is, you have to look at the Civil War to even understand our history in the South. Because the Civil War destroys the South. Completely destroys it. I know for a fact 3 members of my family fought in this war. One in an Arkansas unit, he was wounded in action, so he was a Confederate. One in a Missouri unit, he was a Confederate. One, my great-great-grandfather was in a unit called the 56th Alabama Partisan Rangers. You know what Partisan Rangers did? They killed everybody. Everybody. Look up a man named Quantrell. They killed everybody. They were just mass murderers. That's what Partisan Rangers did. They killed them all. They didn't care. And I'm pretty sure I had one that fought for the Union with my last name. So, I always found it funny a couple years ago when they were destroying all the Confederate monuments, which they're destroying them still to this very day. I'm supposed to treat my relatives as nobodies, which is a stupid idea on anybody's part, but that's the way we think now. All right, I have you know what? We'll do this on Thursday. Are there any questions? Because I did finish that chapter. I'm surprised. All right, so on Thursday, we'll watch this now. On Thursday, we're going to take a quiz over chapter 14. So make sure you have read and studied, all right? It is the last quiz. It's quiz number 10. So we'll watch this video. It covers the entire Civil War. And then Thursday, we'll take the quiz and we'll start chapter 15.
Old men and their families gather at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. These are some of the last surviving veterans of the American Civil War. This is never before seen footage of the last reunion of the blue and the gray. 75 years earlier, these men had inflicted unimaginable suffering on one another. But it was the suffering also that brought them together. 75 years earlier, none of them could have foreseen this. Old bitterness became myth. Deeds became legend. Through smoke, fire, and blood, these men had forged a new nation, a new world, a new birth of freedom. Above all, they were fervently united in the belief that their achievements should be remembered, their battlegrounds preserved, and their stories told. In the middle of the 19th century, Americans North and South look at each other and don't like what they see. Perceptions form. Northerners are greedy and arrogant. Southerners are cruel and lazy. Long-standing arguments about slavery's expansion or abolition flare throughout the 1830s and 40s. Only grudging compromise holds the Union together. By the 1850s, compromise is failing. The fugitive slave crisis brings Southern slaveholders into Northern neighborhoods, while Uncle Tom's Cabin galvanizes many with its portrayal of slavery's cruelties. Legislation intended to make slavery a state-by-state issue leads only to sectarian bloodshed. John Brown's attempt to lead a slave uprising convinces Southerners that their very lives are in danger. Slave states begin to militarize. Two men born in the same state, scarcely 120 miles apart, see it all unfold. Abraham Lincoln is a prairie lawyer turned politician, self-taught but of towering intellect, a wrestler, a storyteller. He is deeply opposed to slavery, but recognizes that the nation's feelings are not yet in line with his own. Jefferson Davis is a reclusive plantation millionaire living in Mississippi, a Mexican war hero, former Secretary of War, now an influential U.S. Senator. When Lincoln wins the 1860 presidential election, Southerners rightly suspect that he plans to abolish or limit slavery. One by one, slave states secede from the Union. Together, they form the Confederate States of America and appoint Jefferson Davis as president. The growing divisions have become very real. By March 1861, the seceded states are seizing federal property and armories within their borders. But the Union soldiers in Fort Sumter refuse to leave. In April, South Carolinians bombard the fort. Federal forces return fire. 34 hours later, the Federals surrender. The first battle of the Civil War is a Confederate victory, with no casualties on either side. President Lincoln refuses to recognize the Confederacy and deems secession unconstitutional. He calls for 75,000 volunteers to quell the rebellion. In response, more states secede, with border states likely to follow. But Lincoln manages to maintain their loyalty with a mixture of political cunning and military coercion. America's roads and byways bustle with enthusiasm and soldiers. Both sides believe the other is weak and that victory will be easy. The opposing forces come to blows in July, 30 miles outside the U.S. Capitol, near a stream called Bull Run. The Yankees pierce the Confederate line, but are forced to retreat after a steady rebel named Thomas Jackson reorganizes the defenders and stands like a stone wall in the face of repeated assaults. With 4,500 casualties, the Battle of Bull Run is the bloodiest battle in American history up to that time. Confederate success continues with victories at Wilson's Creek, Missouri, and at Ball's Bluff, Virginia. Battles flare along the coast as the North begins to blockade southern ports in hopes of strangling the South into submission. Both sides prepare for a long and bloody conflict. The North must conquer the South. Southerners come to see the fight as a second war of independence. And like the first, they need only to hold on until the North tires of conflict, or until they gain foreign recognition. 1862 opens with Union victories in the West. Mill Springs, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Pea Ridge, the fall of Nashville. Up-and-coming General Ulysses S. Grant tells the Confederates at Fort Donelson that no terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. U.S. Grant will be known as Unconditional Surrender Grant for the rest of his life. Grant moves further south, but is attacked by General Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh. The Confederates win the first day, but Johnston is mortally wounded, and the advance stalls as the Federals reorganize along the banks of the Tennessee River. Grant launches an assault of equal ferocity the next day and drives the Confederates from the field. 23,700 men fall in 2 days of action. Union success continues in the Western Territories as Confederate dreams of capturing Southern California are dashed. Union General George McClellan is very slow to move his giant army into Virginia. While McClellan lingers, Stonewall Jackson begins a masterful campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, stirring panic in the north. The world's first battle between ironclad warships, the USS Monitor and CSS Virginia, is fought to a stalemate in Hampton Roads. McClellan at last moves to the Virginia Peninsula by sea. He is slowed by a siege at Yorktown and in battle at Williamsburg and Seven Pines. Although he gets within sight of the Confederate capital at Richmond, he will go no further. With McClellan at the gates, General Robert E. Lee takes command of the defenders around Richmond. Lee is a daring leader and seizes the initiative. Joined by Stonewall Jackson, he attacks McClellan for 7 days, each time driving his opponent further from Richmond. Lee moves northward, hoping to defeat Union forces near Washington before McClellan can help. Jackson wins a battle at Cedar Mountain before rejoining his army for a second victory at Bull Run. Lee is supremely confident. To further demoralize the North, Lee invades Northern Territory, but a copy of his marching orders is found by Union soldiers. McClellan's army moves to destroy Lee's divided forces. The Confederates put up a desperate fight at South Mountain, buying just enough time to reunite near Sharpsburg. McClellan attacks before dawn on September 17th. The fight rages all day and leaves no clear victor. Lee suffers heavy losses, but escapes with his army intact. McClellan will be replaced by General Ambrose Burnside. 23,000 American casualties, more than D-Day, Pearl Harbor, or 9/11. Antietam remains America's bloodiest day. The North declares a victory, and President Lincoln forecasts the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1st, 1863, all slaves in areas under rebellion will be free. France and England had contemplated recognizing the Confederacy, even supplying aid. But both nations have long abolished slavery, and with this proclamation, their support for the South evaporates. Meanwhile, Confederate efforts to regain lost ground in the West are repulsed at Perryville and Corinth. Seeking to overwhelm the Confederacy, Lincoln orders a coordinated offensive, striking targets across the South. But the Union meets with defeat at Chickasaw Bayou and disaster at Fredericksburg. Only a narrow victory by General William Rosecrans at Stones River preserves Northern morale. Lincoln breathes a momentary sigh of relief, but the worst was yet to come. January 1st, 1863, the day of Jubilee. The Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Black men are now allowed to enlist in the Union Army. Black recruits fill the ranks, knowing that military victories will be the only assurance of freedom. Lincoln turns his sights to Vicksburg, the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Vicksburg is the key, declares Lincoln. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. By river, land, and canal, General Grant works from January to April with little progress. Union forces in the east are in disarray. After the bloodbath at Fredericksburg, Lincoln dismisses General Burnside and promotes General Joe Hooker, a hard fighter who pledges no mercy for Robert E. Lee. Hooker crosses the Rappahannock River to outflank Lee near Chancellorsville. Lee strikes back with great fury. Stunned by Lee's aggression, Hooker retreats back across the river after 5 days of savage fighting. In the heat of battle, Stonewall Jackson is mortally wounded by his own men. It is Lee's greatest victory, but he is left in mourning by the death of his most trusted lieutenant. With 30,000 casualties, Chancellorsville is the bloodiest of all American battles up to that time. At the same time, Grant strikes towards Vicksburg. Over the course of 17 days, he wins 5 battles across Mississippi and forces the Confederates to retreat into the river fortress. After failed attacks, Grant lays siege, cutting off their supplies. In June, General Lee invades Pennsylvania. President Lincoln unceremoniously dismisses Hooker and places General George Gordon Meade in command of the Army of the Potomac. On July 1st, 1863, a battle begins between Lee and Meade at Gettysburg. Soldiers pour in for the next 2 days as fighting intensifies. Confederates win on the first day, but Meade's men hold their ground on the second. On the third, Lee launches a grand attack known as Pickett's Charge. That attack fails. Gettysburg is the bloodiest of all American battles. The Union victory sends Lee and his army back to Virginia, weakened but intact. Just as Lee retreats, the Confederates at Vicksburg succumb to 47 days of siege. With the loss of Port Hudson, the Union now controls the...
Yeah, we're gonna stop right there. Real quick, in the very last month of the Civil War, so you're talking about March to April, before Lee surrenders, Confederate government actually talked about arming the slaves to fight the Union. That's how hard up they are to try to win this war. Of course, they do not do that. Can you imagine if they did? Think the slaves are going to fight for the Confederacy? No. I mean, I can just imagine, let's hear it, give all these slaves these guns. Yeah, that was probably a bad idea. That's why they didn't do it. All right, I'm going to stop right there. Y'all will finish this video tomorrow. And remember, quiz on Thursday. And your final papers are coming up due. I believe they're due Thursday.
Yes, sir. Thursday about 10 o'clock.
Yep, the 20th, yep. Thursday by 10 o'clock. So you can either bring me a paper copy on Thursday or email it to me. If you email it to me, send it to me in a PDF. Don't send me Google because I can't open them for some reason. So. And send it to me through MyLeo, not your school account. Any questions? All right.